Okay. Well, welcome everybody to our virtual botany hike at Fernandez Ranch. I hope you're all excited. I'm really excited to see all of this come together. My name is Chris Lim, and I'm the Executive Director at the Contra Costa Resource Conservation District. I'd first off like to thank everybody who took the time out to join us. And I think everybody's in for a treat today. But I'd also like to start off by thanking Linus and his great staff over at John Muir Land Trust for their partnership in this project and for projects beyond. And for Dr. Dean Kelch for helping us out again, as always. Both of you are both great partners to the RCD, and both our board and staff appreciate it very much. So for folks who aren't familiar with the RCD, we are a non-regulatory special district of the state. So we inhabit the space. We're not a 501c3. We're not a full-on government agency. We're kind of in between. And our mission is to conserve the natural resources of Contra Costa County. And we do that through voluntary partnerships. So we work a lot with other nonprofits like John Muir Land Trust, but we also work with watershed groups and creek groups and farmers and ranchers and teachers, and all of those folks of like minds who want to help conserve our environment as well. And so just a little bit of housekeeping for folks, little logistics. If you have any sort of questions through the presentation, please put that into the Q&A. And we'll answer all of those at the end of the presentation. And then if you want to use the chat function as well, that'll go to all the panelists. So if you maybe have any issues with your video or have some general comments, the chat is probably better for that. And then questions can go into the Q&A. So please don't hesitate to use that. And with that, I will pass it on to Heidi to talk about her relationship with Fernandez Ranch and JMLT.
Hi, I'm Heidi Petty. I'm the Watershed Program Manager at Contra Costa Resource Conservation District, and also the chair of the Riquenas Watershed Council, CWC, which is the group that has been working with John Muir Land Trust on these hikes. We've been hosting them for, I don't know, multiple years now. And we had our Botany Hike for spring this year. And lo and behold, we're all in house. So we felt like it would be nice to still have our spring hikes. So I'm pretty happy to partner with John Muir Land Trust and actually bring this to you virtually. I've been working with John Muir Land Trust basically since I started at the RCD. In fact, I was there at groundbreaking for Fernandez Ranch, and I was there when they put the first native plants in the ground. So I've watched it kind of grow and expand, and I've seen all of the work they've done turn into something just wonderful. So I'm super pleased to be here to share that with you, especially during this time when people aren't getting to go on hikes anymore. It's very nice that we're able to see this, and I appreciate Dean Kelch going to all the trouble of taking this hike for us. So without further ado, I'd like to hand this over to Linus Uckel, who is the executive director at John Muir Land Trust. He is a personal hero of mine with all the work that they've done in restorations and preservations of open spaces. So I'd like him to show you a little bit about the process of the creation of Fernandez Ranch, and also bring you up to speed on what John Muir Land Trust does. So without further ado, I will hand that over to Linus.
My screen, and again, speaking of heroes, everybody on the line is hero of mine as well. They've all done great work on behalf of conservation in our area. Are you seeing that share screen? Hello?
Yes, we are.
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, let me make sure that we get going then with the presentation. So, and I'm just going to confirm because I can't see it from your view, but you're able to see that slide. Is that correct?
Yeah, it looks good.
Very clear.
Great. Great. So just to say, we are a local non-governmental 501c3, John Muir Land Trust, and again, thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. Linus Schukel, Executive Director for JMLT, and really excited to be part of this virtual botany hike with Dr. Dean Kelch, who has been a long-time contributor and out on property, very familiar with this property, and we appreciate all of his efforts along with Heidi and others. So in terms of who we are, nonprofit 501c3, and hold on one second, you guys, I'm getting a little bit of interference here. Sorry, bear with me. And sorry, just hold on one second. See if we can get this right. I want you to be able to see everything. I think this is going to work now. So 501c3, local nonprofit, and our job, our mission is to protect and care for open space, ranches, farms, parkland, and shoreline in the East Bay. So that's our mission, and the reason we do it is to ensure that beauty and diversity and fullness of the natural areas continue to enrich and sustain all generations of life. And so we're working hard all the time to try and make sure that's the outcome. And the way we where we do it is in this particular service area. And that is, as you can see, essentially the East Bay, Contra Costa and Alameda counties, and out to the lower delta along the Carquinez shoreline. So there's a lot of work along shoreline, but also in all of the hills and valleys of the central part of Contra Costa County and Alameda. When we well, I'm having lots go on here. Sorry about this. I want to make sure that we get through this correctly, so bear with me here. So when we acquire land in that service area, we are then inspired to create a property icon, and we work with Megan Mailer, our beautiful graphics designer, to create these kinds of images. And today we're going to focus specifically on Fernandez Ranch. And I'm here to give you a little background about how that place came to be. And welcome to Fernandez Ranch. This is what it looks like. It's a gorgeous property. Definitely something that we're very proud to offer to the public as a natural resource and public recreation destination. Let me show you where it is. This is the aerial view of Fernandez Ranch. So coming along Highway 4, there's an exit to Christie Road. You come down Christie Road to this staging area, and you have access to all of this property. When you get there, this is the kind of map of trails that you'd be able to see and or acquire as a brochure off of our website, and all of the trails that are available to you when you're out there. Glenn Lewis and our stewardship committee volunteers work hard to maintain this property for your enjoyment. We want to make sure that you understand our properties are open, and we hope you'll visit, and you'll visit sometime soon, especially after learning so much more from Dr. Kelch about what you might find out there. When you do visit, please do so safely. Remember to maintain social distancing, bring a mask, and use hand sanitizers, all of that. We all know that nature is a good medicine for all of us, but please be sensible, take the precautions for your own safety and for the protection of others. And you can find out more about that on our website as to how to use the property safely, this and others. So when JMLT purchased the ranch in 2005, and again to Heidi's reference, one of the greatest challenges that came with it was Rodeo Creek, which for years had undergone large-scale changes. And in fact, Heidi was a participant in the Rodeo Creek Watershed Vision Planning Group at the RCD, and they created a study document to help the Land Trust secure funding for an almost $4 million restoration and public access project at Fernandez Ranch. So you can see the dramatic erosion that had cut this deep channel, stripped banks of vegetation, and toppled trees all along the riparian corridor. And this is Eric Stromberg from the Restoration Design Group, sort of risking life and limb down in that heavily incised channel. You can see how heavily in size the banks had become, trees giving way and so forth. The creek was essentially trying to heal itself by laying back its banks to more natural balance. But in doing so, you can see there that it produces sheer cliffs, very unstable bank, which also creates a really significant public safety hazard. And there's another view of it there. You can also see the channel down in the bottom, the creek, serving to erode away all of that as the banks slump, and a lot of sediment going out into the bay as well. We also had to haul tons of junk, ranch junk, out of the creek. This was a very labor-intensive issue. It's very expensive to do, so please don't dump stuff in the creek. Eventually somebody's got to drag it back out, and it's not easy work. But once that was done, we brought in heavy equipment to help shape and restore the creek with those graders, backhoes, and intentionally laying back the creeks to what is more or less a 2-to-1 slope to accelerate that repair, to accelerate that healing. Doing that, we placed wobbles along those newly created creek banks. And you can see here, established a new floodplain along the creek bed right there, and covered that new slope in preparation for planting and irrigation. And then JMLT planted almost 10,000 native trees and shrubs, germinated from seeds collected at Fernandez Ranch by the one and only Dr. Dean Kelch and his crew that were then carefully propagated by our partners at the Watershed Nursery. So we're very, very grateful to Dr. Kelch for all of that work to make sure that we had natives from the ranch to propagate and then plant. JMLT owns and stewards more than 1/5 of the entire Rodeo Creek watershed. And this particular restoration work improves the quality of the whole watershed, including the riparian habitat, both on the Fernandez Ranch property and downstream. So then there was a 100-year flood, so we were able to successfully test it, and you can see that beautiful meander there. The floodplain that was established just worked out very well. And we then set out to build a 156-foot clear span bridge across Rodeo Creek. The reason being that more than 90% of Fernandez Ranch is on the other side of the creek from the staging area, so making the bridge a required component for access. And that bridge now provides year-round access for public recreation and also provides capacity for fully loaded emergency vehicles to access the hills in case of fire and so forth. So it's a great access point, and it's a signature element in the restoration design to cross that bridge. Once over there, we built multi-use trails open to hikers and bicycle riders and equestrians, including right now, as I say, these properties are open, and specifically Fernandez Ranch, including the visitors with limited mobility. ADA also enjoys 2 wheelchair accessible trails that eventually connect to steeper trails leading toward hill summits. They're beautiful trails that gently wind through the oak canopy. You see it there again. And they eventually find their way to the top of the ridge. And when you get out there visiting Fernandez Ranch, as you can see, is a beautiful experience with beautiful landscapes. We invite you to come visit soon, enjoy the gorgeous trails, visit and view the beautiful chartreuse colors of spring. And when you do visit, we invite you to enjoy a variety of interpretive tours on Visit. Download the Visit app to your smartphone. You'll be able to experience tours as listed here, bringing back the land, a walk on the wild side, stroll back in time. Pacing planets is great for young kids. You start at the sun and pace all the way out to Pluto. And so you get sort of that spatial recognition of how far away the planets are from the sun. For young children, I think it's a great experience. And again, this Visit mobile app, it's a docent-led tour at a lot of different levels where even while you're socially distancing, you can have that experience. Other ways to become involved and connected to JMLT are listed here. The Nature Gratitude Challenge is going all the way through July 4th. Go to our website to find out about that. We invite you to become involved with the oak tree monitoring. We have a sod blitz happening May 9th. That's this coming Saturday, but you'll need to train by Thursday, May 7th. We've been working with the UC Berkeley Forest Pathology and mycology lab for years to map distribution of sudden oak death. You can really, participate in that citizen science and help us by doing that, Trade by Thursday. And also trail monitoring is ongoing. You can participate in photography, become an ambassador. Just go to jmlt.org/volunteer/calendar to learn more. And we'd love to have you become more and more a part of that community. And with no further ado, I would introduce Dr. Dean Kelch, California State Botanist. I know you're going to enjoy this virtual botany tour, and we're very grateful to Dean for undertaking this and making it happen for all of you to enjoy. So, Dean?
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Fernandez Ranch. My name is Dean Kelch. I'm a local botanist. Today I'm going to be leading this virtual hike of the Fernandez Ranch. This property has been preserved by the Muir Land Trust. A local land trust has really managed to acquire a lot of beautiful properties in this particular area of the southern part of the Carquinez Strait. It's also co-sponsored by the Contra Costa Resource Conservation District, which is an organization that does a lot of good work, particularly when it comes to water quality and restoring riparian areas. So today is a beautiful spring day, gorgeous. Yesterday we had quite a bit of rain, but today it's actually sunny with nice puffy clouds. And we're going to see a lot of the spring wildflowers that are common around in this area, as well as many of the woody plants, the trees and shrubs that kind of form the main plant communities in this particular site. So without hesitation, let's go, let's start, and we'll start our hike. This is the main meadow of the Fernandez Ranch. Remember, the name of the site is the ranch, and it used to be a ranch property. Just like almost all the areas of grassland around the whole Bay Area, even a lot of areas of woodland, this area was heavily grazed for well over 100 years. And there's still cattle. They're run out in this site, and one of the big reasons to run the cattle is so that they help control some of the non-native weeds and things that are growing that dominate particularly these low areas with nice, thick, rich soil. And if we look through this area right now where we're starting out, we don't see a lot of native plants. We see a lot of non-native species, particularly these annual grasses that mostly came from the Mediterranean area very early on in European colonization of California area. And also some of the forbs or the non-grassy weeds too that come from that particular area. And if we walk around a little bit and poke around, we might see a few of the natives, but not too many. Not too many in these areas. Here we have lots of mustards. You can see all the grasses around us. And aha, over here, I almost walked by it. Here's one of our nice native wildflowers. This particular wildflower is the yellow owl's clover. You can see it right here growing surrounded by all these non-native grasses and other weeds, including mayweed right here next to it. And this is a little plant that belongs to this group that has many different species that live in the grasslands of California. But just like almost all these little annuals, these little native wildflowers, they're not doing quite as well as they used to. When we walk up the hill, we're likely to see more of these, because when you get up the hill, we get to areas that perhaps they're grazed, certainly, but not as heavily grazed for so long as these areas down here. And also the soil's a little bit thinner, so that the native species seem to have more of a competitive edge in these areas that have thinner or less fertile soil than they do down here in these very rich, deeper soil, where these weeds, grasses, and other weeds from the Mediterranean region that have been co-evolving with human disturbance for thousands of years seem to really are favored down in these areas. So, but let's move on. So let's start moving on until we get to the some of the little more native areas of the site. Where we're standing right here, I'd like to, is a good place as any for us to talk about some of the major plant communities we're going to see here today, or we are seeing here as we're here today on our virtual tour. As we just went over, we walked through the meadow with a lot of grasses and a lot of little herbaceous plants, most of which are not native. But as we get over here, a little bit more to the east, we can see we're starting to get shrubs, and then past the shrub zone, we have a bunch of trees. Now, what we're looking at here is a transition between three different of the most common habitats in the San Francisco Bay Area. One is grassland of various kinds. Second of all is what would be called northern coastal scrub, and that's dominated by what is the most common shrub in California. Is probably this one right here. This is coyote brush, Baccharis pilularis, and you'll see this everywhere. It's a rather nondescript thing, but you can recognize it once you get to know it pretty well. It doesn't flower really, oddly enough, until summer. So most of the time in the year when you see it, it'll be like this, just green. And then behind there, you'll see a bunch of trees. In this particular area, this is along the creek, so we could call this a riparian forest, if you will, but it really is a phase of what we might call in general the mixed evergreen forest, which is a dominant forest type where you find forest in this whole part of Northern California. And this particular phase of the forest would be dominated by two species. One is an oak, Quercus agrifolia, the coast live oak, and the other one being the California bay, the Umbellularia californica. Now, this interesting mixture of oaks and members of the laurel family happens here and there across the world in these subtropical to warm temperate areas that have usually periods of at least slight drought, not always as much drought as we have here in California, but you do find these mixtures. Here we're finding a very not very speciose part of it, where mostly it's just two species growing together along the higher reaches of the creek. Of course, if we went down further into the creek, we'd start finding the real riparian or riverine species like willows and things like that, and we'll see some of those as we go along later. This is a coast live oak, Quercus agrifolia. So if any of you live anywhere in North America, or really almost anywhere in the northern hemisphere where there's woody vegetation, you probably have oaks. Sometimes they're evergreen, sometimes they're deciduous. In California, and here in Fernandez Ranch, we have both kinds in California. And so we'll see both these evergreen oaks that are just starting to put out their new leaves, but still have the leaves from last year, even while they're flowering. Now, maybe some of you didn't really think about oaks flowering, but of course they do. You can see these little tassels hanging down. These are the catkins that are the male flowers that have the pollen, and then the female flowers would be nestled in the ends of the new growth, because of course they eventually mature into what? Into acorns. And I actually picked this little branchlet of one from last year that still has some of the acorns on it that never matured really. They just aborted. So this particular one shows this is really an oak. So no matter what the leaves look like, if it's deciduous or evergreen or whatever, you can tell it's an oak if it has acorns. That's how you can tell it's oak. Of course, it only usually has acorns in the fall, so it's always nice to learn some other ways to do it. It also produces it's a major food source for almost every kind of animal you can imagine around here. And back before Europeans came here, the acorn crop was the major food crop of the Native Americans who lived in this area. Of course, they are full of tannins. They're very bitter tasting if you just eat them. So they had very often very long, laborious ways to remove these bitter elements to make it edible, to make the starch edible. But obviously these acorns can some years produce a very, very good food source. The problem with acorns as a food source is not just the bitterness, but also the fact that they're extremely unreliable. Some years there's almost none. Some years there's a whole lot. And this is in response usually to environmental or climatic or just weather type situation. However, it's not an accident because so many things, insects, rodents, birds, and humans, of course, love to eat acorns. Acorns tend to they have these some years they produce so many acorns that not they can't all be eaten. Some of them survive to grow into new trees. Other years they have such low amounts that the things that rely on those acorns to live die off and have very low population levels. And that's how you get these nice, then big mast years, as they call them, when they produce lots of acorns. And at that point in time, like I said, they are low populations of the things that feed on them, and it takes them a while to build up their population. And during that one season, then they can replenish their numbers by having a lot of small seedlings. And you'll still see this in some years where we have a good mast year of acorns, where then the next spring and the year after that and year after that, you'll see a lot of these young little coast live oaks coming up around. Some of the other oak species we have here don't seem to reproduce as well. Most like the blue oak, which we'll see later, mostly will only reproduce very rarely, and most of the plants you see, even though they're not as big as this, are very, very old indeed. Now right here we can see a deciduous tree that's just starting to put out some of its leaves. This is the valley oak. This is the largest oak in California. Quercus lobata is its name, and it's very common up and down the Central Valley and in the central and southern coast range of California. And when you go further north, it tends to drop out and is replaced by Oregon oak. But here it is many different habitats. It can be, particularly in the Central Valley, it was the dominant tree of the giant riparian gallery forests that were here when Europeans first came here along the rivers of the Central Valley. But even out here, it can grow as here along a creek side, if it can find another place and not be outcompeted by coast live oak. But also you find it up in these north-facing slopes and these sloping areas where it forms sort of an open woodland or even a savanna sometimes, where it gets a fair amount of water, not as dry as, say, the blue oak, but still very common. But it's down here in these valleys where you really get some size on these things. You really see them getting huge and deserving the reputation as the largest oak in North America. Now the leaves of this oak are very much like the white oak. They're a white oak group, which tend to have these deciduous, lobed leaves. This is very much like the white oak of eastern North America in many ways. These are just starting to emerge, but soon they'll be much larger than the leaves of the evergreen oaks that we have here. This is nice. We're walking along a side channel of the main creek here, and we can see many of these natural species that occur in this riparian zone. Down in the channel itself, we have in the foreground, we have California Bay. Behind it, we have California buckeye, a deciduous species. Back there, the large tree would be coast live oak. And here in the foreground, where we have a little more sun, where the trees haven't taken over yet, we have coyote brush with a bunch of poison oak growing up through it, a very common species around here, a little bit of snowberry, as well as, if we look further down in the channel, some nice willow trees that are growing there where they have their roots in water all year long. And this is the kind of vegetation you find along all the creeks in this part of California. And it's sort of this mixture of what we would see as a regular creekside vegetation and what we also describe as sort of a general evergreen woodland type vegetation you also find in north-facing slopes. The things I always look for as spring begins is the very first California buttercups to raise their heads and to open up their little flowers. As you can see, this is a beautiful spring wildflower. It has these nice multi-petaled flowers that are not only bright yellow, but if you look at them in this bright sun, you can see how shiny they are. It's if they've been lacquered. And so even though they're not very big flowers, when they have displays like this of thousands and thousands of plants, it makes a beautiful display that is really is the most cheerful things about spring in this particular area. This is a Woodland Star here, a little member of the saxifrage family. It's a Lithophragma heterophila. And this is a plant, little white-flowered plant that has these nicely little cut petal. Each petal is cut into 3 or more pieces. And there are 2 species that are very common around here. One is this one that grows in the shaded edge of woodland areas, and another area, one that grows out in little more, also on steep banks, but a little more sunlight. We've got manroot too, or wild cucumber, but I'd like to see it in flower. Ooh, here's a nice plant, but not flowering here. This little vine here that I'm showing you is an odd little vine. It's here and there. It's not particularly rare, but it very rarely flowers, and so it makes you wonder almost how it forms seed and spreads around. Of course, once it does form a nice population, it can send up these little roots underground, these little stems grow underground and come up and form almost an ineradicable patch. And these patches can be pretty good size, which is a good thing for at least one butterfly. And this is the California pipevine that we're looking at, Aristolochia californica. And this is the only local food plant of the pipevine swallowtail butterfly. And whenever you are out walking this time of year, a little bit later in spring, you'll see these very large black butterflies with these iridescent blue hind wings. This is the pipevine swallowtail butterfly, and it's usually, if you look at it and follow it long enough, it's usually not too far away from a population of the California pipevine, because that's where it's going to lay its eggs. I said, we had a very large rainstorm, the largest of the season yesterday, and even though it's sunny and bright today and a lot of stuff is drying out, there's still these certain areas that are muddy. This is one of the best advantages to being on a virtual tour, is you don't have to slog through these various little areas of mud. You can just enjoy the beautiful day and the beautiful flowers without actually having to experience some of the inconveniences and discomforts of being out in the field. But the mud doesn't last very long, and we already go into a beautiful area of grassland with oak woodland behind it. One of the things that when you're out hiking at this time of year, particularly if you're in a moist canyon, is you have to be careful for the California newts. This is the time of year when they're out and about trying to find places to breed or to live, and out hunting for little slugs and other invertebrates that they feed upon. And when you're walking in these shady understories, these kind of habitats that they like, you can often find quite a few of them. And so you have to be, sometimes there's so many that you really have to be cautious not to step on a newt as you go around. It's very bad luck to step on a newt. And this time of year is one of the special things about this time of year is the plethora of California newts that you can see when you go into the moist canyons in the East Bay. Now we've gone up the ridge quite a ways, and we're walking along the edge of a woodland, and we're right in the area that might be called a general coast live oak woodland mixed with some of the valley oak. But if we look across the way, we can see on that south-facing slope very few trees, and part of that might be the history of the site. Maybe it was logged much more than the area over here, but a lot of that has to do with the fact that south-facing slopes are a lot hotter and drier than north-facing slopes. And so what we call aspect has a big impact on what you find growing there. And in fact, it's not just subtle. There you have almost all grassland. Here on this north-facing slope, turn around this way, on this north-facing slope, you'll see almost all trees dominating the landscape. Now right here, I'm going to step off the path a little bit to look at two interesting plants. One of them is a plant that can look different in different places, unfortunately, because this plant is poison oak here that we're looking at, this shrub with the very, very long, unbranched branches, the three-parted leaves. Remember the old saying, leaflets three, let it be. And here we see something we don't see all the time, which is the spring flowers of poison oak. Now, sometimes you can detect a distinct sweet fragrance coming off of these flowers, but I don't really recommend sticking your nose into them for various reasons. You can also see growing over this poison oak very happily is a plant that's sometimes called the California wild cucumber or the manroot. This is Mara fabaceus, and it really is a member of the cucumber family. And it'll have these little white flowers, look quite a bit like the poison oak flowers really, but the female ones at least will form these really nice spiny fruits about the size of a ping pong ball. Let's go over here and see the young fruits on a very, very early flowering shrub. This is the California gooseberry. And if you've ever had gooseberries to eat or had gooseberry jam, it's made out of a domesticated one that doesn't have these spines. But one of the things that separates out gooseberries from currants, because they're close relatives, is the fact that the majority, not all, but the majority of gooseberries have these spines on their fruits. So they're not very good to eat for most things, although they're delicious inside. And you would say, why would a plant that's going to all the trouble to make these delicious berries put all these spines on the outside to prevent things from munching on them? And I don't know the answer to it, but I do know that it tends to be birds that do eat the inside of the fruit. They peck a hole in it, and instead of eating the whole fruit down, they have to just take the pith out of it, the kind of gelatinous, delicious part of it, and at the same time they'll eat the seeds and pass those through, and presumably prevent things from munching on them. And I don't know the answer to it, but I do know that it tends to be birds that do eat the inside of the fruit. They peck a hole in it, and instead of eating the whole fruit down, they have to just take the pith out of it, the kind of gelatinous, delicious part of it, and at the same time they'll eat the seeds and pass those through, and presumably prevent things from munching on them. Most of the ones at the top of the slope are deciduous. As you go down the slope, you can see deciduous, but you can also see some of the evergreen coast live oak. All of these are oaks that I can see from here. And if we look at the very large oak tree in the middle, that is valley oak, Quercus lobata. And now if you go to the very top of the hill, you can see another deciduous oak. And you notice how the leaves on that one, they're just emerging, they look grayer. They don't look as fresh green, they look a little dusty even. And that would be our other common deciduous oak in this area. This is blue oak, Quercus douglasii. And blue oak is an oak. It often grows, as here, close to valley oak, but it often grows in the very driest sites. The more high, it tends to be higher up the hill, higher up the ridge, where it grows in these very dry sites. And in fact, this is a tree that becomes very common in the very low foothills of the Sierra Nevada, where it forms a very typical, what they call a blue oak savanna, sometimes in association with gray pine, Pinus sabiniana. Here we don't have Pinus sabiniana, but we do have blue oaks growing on the drier sites, particularly in the upper parts of north-facing slopes. So here we have our third species of common deciduous oak tree in this part of California, although it's not as common here as it is in the foothills of the Sierra. But this is California black oak, Quercus kalogii, named after one of the co-founders of the California Academy of Sciences. And you can see how different this oak is than the other ones we're looking at. First of all, the leaves are a lot bigger. Second of all, although we didn't have mature leaves in the other ones, you can see how pointy-tipped the lobes are on this one. And this is one of the distinguishing characteristics of the two main groups of oaks, the white oaks and the red or black oaks. And the valley oak and the blue oak belong to the white oak group, and the California black oak, of course, belongs to the black oak group. And this plant, there are many different plants that look like this, species of oak Quercus in the eastern United States, some of them very hard to tell apart, but different species. Here in the West Coast, we only have one of these very typical looking, quote unquote, red or black oaks, and that is the California black oak. If you live in this area, one of the special plants around here that you can only find at Fernandez Ranch nearby is this one. This is a baby blue eyes, Nemophila menziesii, and it's an absolutely gorgeous plant. Most of the flowers that people describe as blue, or particularly nursery catalogs describe as blue, are some shade of purple. They're not really a true blue. But in baby blue eyes, we really do have that very, very rare shade of true blue, in this case kind of a sky blue. And this particular annual plant is one of the most beautiful wildflowers in California. It's not particularly rare in the state, but around here it is. In the Carquinez area, in Contra Costa County, it really is a very rare plant. And the only plant I've seen it locally, as I said before, is right here at Fernandez Ranch. And you have to come out right here in April, because it's a very early flowering wildflower, so you have to come out in April in order to see this gorgeous plant. And if you're lucky, you might even find a hillside that's, in some years, is almost covered by this particular beautiful, beautiful plant. As we go up the ridge, we start getting the thinner soil. We start picking up a very, very widespread wildflower. This is red maids. Not really red, it's more of a magenta. Red maids is found almost throughout California in open grassy areas. One suspects it was much, much, much more common before Europeans got here and introduced all the annual grasses, because it tends to grow in those same kind of places. And you don't see very good displays of it anymore. This is pretty nice right here, but still nothing spectacular. Mostly you only see the spectacular displays in very dry areas, in some places in Central Valley, or on serpentine-derived soil, where the soils are full of heavy metals and other things that make them poisonous to plants. And there the native plants, native annual wildflowers tend to have an advantage over the annual grasses from Europe, and they tend to be able to give us probably an idea of what all the grasslands in California were like before the introduction of so many different invasive species of annual grasses and forbs. One of the most beautiful wildflowers, spring wildflowers, certainly of woodland wildflowers in California, is the purple Trillium, which is called Trillium chloropetulum, is the scientific name. And this is part of a northern genus that's found in woodlands. Like the eastern United States has quite a few species. China has quite a few species. We have a few here on the West Coast, but this is one of the biggest species of all. And if you go in certain areas, like in the Santa Cruz Mountains, this plant is not common, but still not very rare. In the East Bay, this plant has become rather rare, partly maybe because of people digging it up or people developing the land, but a lot of it had to do probably with the rebounding of the deer population. As deer conservation began back in the 1920s. Because Ruth Bancroft, of the Ruth Bancroft Garden fame, who lived to 107, she had told me years ago that when she was a girl in the Berkeley Hills back, right, in like the teens or early 20s, Trillium was in fact very common in the East Bay, but now you really have to go out of your way to find it. And we're very lucky that the Muir Land Trust has preserved the Fernandez Ranch, because here's this really very, very nice population, small, but very, very nice population of the purple-flowered Trillium. Here we are walking through some of the nice muddy areas that are left over from yesterday's big rainstorm that we had. And this is one of the nicest things, really, about being on a virtual tour, is that you can take advantage of the beautiful day and all the nice wildflowers, but you don't have to slog through the mud or later in the year fight the mosquitoes and the ticks, or worry about a angry cow coming after you as you walk through the area. You can just take all the enjoyment and none of the discomforts. Okay, so you wanted me to do what?
Just kind of give me a look.
Okay. You want me to be turned like this or turned all the way around?
Yeah, turn all the way around.
Okay.
And then just turn around and leave.
That was great. Dean, that was wonderful. First off, I would just like to thank everyone who came to participate in this virtual hike. And Dean, thank you so much for such an informative and beautiful day. It was just a beautiful day that day. I can't even begin to tell you how many times you've done this for me at this point, but to do it this way is even more interesting. And I think everybody really got that bird's eye view of all the plants this time, which I'm very grateful for. I'd also like to thank Eric Akison, who is our newest member of the RCD. He did all of this wonderful video production and brought in all of the different video editing gear and made it all mesh together beautifully. And again, thank you to Linus for the wonderful display about John Muir Land Trust and their properties at the beginning. I think we're going to open it up to question and answer now. Behind the scenes, we have Glenn Lewis, who is the open space ranger at John Muir Land Trust. He's here to answer questions as well. Hannah Hodgins, who is the community programs manager over at John Muir Land Trust, and she's here as well. And Lisa Damerol of the RCD, who has done a lot of the help in the backstage of all of this, is behind the scenes as well to help answer all the questions. So without further ado, let's start our question and answer session.
Thank you so much, Heidi. This is Lisa. We got quite a few great questions during the hike. And we'll start off with, Jeff had a question about where can we access the pre-project Fernandez Ranch photos? So Linus, could you let us know about that?
Those are in our archive. They're not posted on the website, but if you want to send me an email, it's just linus@jmlt.org, and we can figure out a way for you to be able to view those. We've got a lot of construction photos and pre-restoration photos of the ranch. So
Great.
Happy to share those.
Yeah, thank you. Elaine commented that she just got back from a hike at Fernandez Ranch, and she's wondering, how did the ranchers get to the property with the creek in the way? And I'm thinking maybe Linus or perhaps Glenn might be able to take this.
Well, there was.
Go ahead.
Just going to say rough trail that went down into the creek, and they had some junk thrown in the creek they walked across, and but it was very difficult. It was pretty much impassable when the creek was flowing. So the bridge was a big improvement in terms of getting vehicles. Go ahead.
I'll jump in on that as well. So formerly the ranch had a large culvert bridge. So there was a culvert that carried water through, and then dirt across that culvert for the ranchers to cross. And this was a typical kind of construction back in the day. That culvert is actually what blew out in a major storm. And when that blew out, it started a great deal of erosion and head cutting and so forth. So even though it's already a kind of a silty bank and tends toward that kind of erosion, that blowout really damaged Rodeo Creek. So when we built the clear span bridge, it was specifically to avoid that kind of architecture, which is very subject to that kind of accident and damage. That's why we're fully out of the creek with our new bridge.
Thanks, Linus and Glenn. It's great background to have.
Sure.
So next we'll go to, Chris had a question about, this is for Dean. He says, I learned that oak trees host many caterpillars which feed local native birds. Can you comment on that? So maybe what kind of caterpillars you've seen on our oaks, and what kind of birds eat them?
Well, almost all birds are insectivores, particularly in the springtime when they're raising their young. And so almost any birds would be eating the little caterpillars and various larvae that feed on oaks. Very few of the big, beautiful butterflies that we think about feed on the evergreen oaks, although some of them supposedly do occasionally, but most of the things that feed on the oaks are moth.
we'd call them moths, are very small little things that as adults are not very showy. But all kinds of insects, because remember I mentioned in the video how common oaks are and how dominant they are in North American woody plant-dominated plant communities. And despite the fact that oaks are, the leaves as well as the fruits are just replete with tannins, they're just full of these very bitter chemicals. They're such a common resource that many different kinds of animals, including insects, especially insects, have evolved to eat them. Now, one of the things that when we talk about our native plants and native trees and native forests that we should keep in mind is that ability of theirs to support this huge amount of invertebrate fauna that we don't even see 99% of it. But of course, as you say, the birds eat it. The birds eat it, other animals eat it, and they form the basis of the entire food pyramid for that area. If you go to an area where it's planted in Eucalyptus globulus, the blue gum or blue eucalyptus that we see so commonly around the Bay Area, they're very beautiful trees, of course, but they support almost no insects. Very few insects will feed on them. Now, back in Australia, of course, where they're native, it's a very different story. But here, they support very few of those, so they actually support much less of this entire web and pyramid of animals than the native trees, like the native oaks do.
Thank you, Dean. While we're talking about oaks, Peter had a question. Do small, scruffy coastal oak scrub brushes grow into large live coastal oak trees if given the chance, or are they different species or different morphs of the same species?
Actually, there's a very simple answer to that, which is they will grow. It's usually, we would talk about the difference between genetic dwarfism and dwarfism just because they're kind of bonsai'd by the local conditions. When we're talking about coast live oaks, there are, particularly when you go right to the coast in these windswept areas and these very low fertility sandy soils, you can get these kind of dwarfed oaks. And but I bet if you took acorns from those and put them in a fertile site, they would grow very large. Now, the so-called interior live oak, which there's a coastal form of it, which is called a different species, which looks quite a bit like the coast live oak. It does have seemingly sometimes this genetic dwarf that grows out in the chaparral, the shrub dominated habitat. But even there, I've seen examples where you find the shrub growing in the very sterile, sandy soil, and then just a few feet away, you find these very large trees. So largely that's an environmental effect and not a genetic one, although in some cases it can be both. And we do have some oaks that never get in trees. They just always stay as shrubs.
All right. Thank you, Dean. So we had a question about when this was filmed, and it was a couple of weeks ago, right? I believe.
That's right. It was about 4 weeks ago, and it was a little long between, as a virtual tour, it was a little long between doing it and showing it, but it got this beautiful editing that Eric did, like integrating the various different shots and things like that. Many of these species, because we haven't had a lot of hot weather since then, a lot of them will still be in flower, as well as some new species that came out a little bit later if you go out there now.
Great. Yeah. Do you think any of the species that you covered in the hike video are still blooming, or could you maybe talk about what is blooming now?
Buttercups, there's certainly still buttercups out and about. The trilliums I looked at, they may be fading by now, but there may be a few still out there flowering. The Woodland Star could still be flowering. Certainly the baby blue eyes would be just about finished, but I bet you could still go out and find a few plants. The red maids, there probably are a few scattered out there. Yeah, I'm sure there are actually those. Almost all the things that we saw would have at least some flowers out still, and as well as, like, since we're entering into the very late spring flowering, you probably pick up a few other things we didn't see.
Great. Let's see. Paul had a question that might be best for Dean or Glenn. Do you have any idea how grazing helps or hinders the production of wildflowers at Fernandez Ranch?
I can take a quick stab at it, Glenn, and you can, if you want to answer about the specific conditions of what you try to aim for when you're managing.
Okay.
But I say it's very clear from looking at that site, when you go up toward the higher ridge where we were out in that big open area that was covered in grass, those grasses are grazed. And up there where the native wildflowers and even native grasses have an ability to compete on the thinner soils. Their grazing grazing at certain times of year to a certain extent is a very actually good thing for the native species. Generally in speaking, when people say is grazing good or is grazing bad, that is a false dichotomy. When we're talking about the effect of grazing on maintaining biodiversity or contributing to native plant species growing, it's all about when and how much. That's what it is.
Yeah, I'll just say when you first walk across the bridge, there's an area that is not grazed there because it's fenced off so the cows can't get out and get into the street and everything, of course. So that area, it's really a thick mat that covers the ground. And I'm not a botanist, but as I understand it, that makes it very difficult for a lot of the native forbs and flowers to come up through there. So when you get up more on the open areas that are grazed, the thatch is a lot thinner, and that allows the native plants to come through.
Thank you, Dean and Glenn. Next, I think we're going to go to Mary's question about, this is for Dean. Are there any other species of Trillium found in the East Bay or Contra Costa County? And also, does Fernandez Ranch have any really cool rare plant species that you want to talk about?
Let me think. I hope the Trillium is locally rare. There are two species in the Bay Area. There's a little white one that flowers very early, but as far as I know, it's not found in the East Bay. If you want to see it, you should go in late February or early March to Muir Woods, and then you can see the white Trillium over in Marin County, at the base of Mount Tamalpais. So in the coastal area and the Santa Cruz Mountains, to a lesser extent, you do get this small little white Trillium. But otherwise, the purple one is the only one you see. And then when you go to the north, you very quickly, like really by the time you reach Napa, in the hills there, you can find a very similar species of large Trillium that does have kind of pale white petals. So it's obviously closely related to this maroon petaled one. And whether it's a different species or a color form, botanists are still arguing about, but certainly it is a bit different. So if you go up to the north, you find a different one, and if you go to the east, to the coast, you can find one different one. As far as sensitive plant species, I'm trying to think about what actually would grow there. When I was working in the whole Carquinez area as a whole, there weren't a lot of globally rare species in our area because we don't have the diversity in the kinds of things that drive rarity in California. Some of those are highly areas with a lot of higher rainfall up in the north, and these would harbor species that otherwise are ancient that are going extinct, and so they're rare for that reason. Whereas through most of California, we might find really rare species in areas that had very unusual soils, such as serpentine-derived soils, like I mentioned in the hike video. And we don't have those kind of mineral conditions around here in the Carquinez area, including the Fernandez Ranch. We do have one plant that, as far as I know, hasn't been found in the Fernandez Ranch. Probably doesn't occur because it's very rare. It's only found. This is the western leatherwood, Dirca occidentalis, and it belongs to the Daphne family. It's the only really native North American member of that family, except there's an eastern species. And that one grows actually above Crockett in where I live. I live in Crockett, and lives in the canyon above there. And otherwise, that species is only found in the 6 counties that surround the bay, and it's only found in like 2 or 3 places in each of those counties. So it's a plant, a very ancient relic type plant that just hangs out in these areas. So that one is rare and occurs in Crockett. There are also some plants, there are also some clay lenses that you find around our area. And really the soil doesn't look that much different in many of the grassland species that they support or not, but you'll find some of these plants that do tend to do better in clay. There's a little, so called a coyote thistle, but it's really not a thistle, it's a member of the carrot family. And you also find a beautiful calochortus. If you know that plant, they look like sort of wild tulips that we have that are natives. There's one species that only grows on clay that lives in our area. And there's some other calochortuses. Glenn, have you ever seen a calochortus out at these like I said, these beautiful liliaceous bulbous plants that have flowers like a little tulip in Fernandez Ranch? There's one or two species that may well occur there, but I've never seen them.
No, I don't know that I've ever seen one of those. The somewhat rare plant that I'm familiar with out there is the Diablohelianthella, and those are scattered here and there. They look a lot like the mule's ear, but I guess the veins in the leaves are a little bit different, and so those are interesting.
Yeah, oh, that's very true. So that's a plant that's also called the Mount Diablo dwarf sunflower, and as the name implies, it was mostly known from Mount Diablo, but it actually occurs in, I believe it's in San Francisco, still barely. It occurs in Mount San Bruno in northern San Mateo, and it occurs in several places like near Pleasant Hill and places like that, as well as in these hills, these sort of hills that Pinot Peak, that Fernandez Ranch is part of. It occurs in these scrubby areas in there. It's a very attractive little plant, and it's really should be starting to flower quite soon. You have the regular mule ears that were flowering still as of 2 or 3 weeks ago are starting to fade out. The narrow leaf mule ears, which you also have, you have both those species on Fernandez Ranch, and you have this very similar look-alike, which is a more distant relative, the dwarf sunflower. So you have all three of those on Fernandez Ranch. They're well worth looking for.
Great. And Glenn and Dean, Diane wanted to know if there are any madrone trees up at Fernandez Ranch.
I have not seen any. Madrone in the Carquinez region is quite rare, and I think it was never super common, but my suspicion is most of it was logged out. And because people, particularly when the railroad came through, all the valleys that came south, that flowed north into the Carquinez Strait, they were heavily logged to provide wood for the wood-fired engines of the trains. And so I suspect that madrone was never super common, but that it disappeared. Now there is a wonderful, wonderful patch of it. The largest patch locally is on, it may well be on Muir Land Trust land, but I think it's on a different property. It's not on Fernandez Ranch. It's a little further to the east.
Dean, can you hear me?
Yes.
Could you also comment about the Contra Costa Goldfields, which we preserve just across the highway, just across on Highway 4?
Yeah, no, that's actually, thank you, Linus. I had forgotten that one. So it's not in Fernandez Ranch, but it's very close. It's within a mile of the site. And it's this area, the goldfields, of course, these little teeny annuals that have little yellow daisy flowers. And there's several different species. Now, some of them are very widespread, very common, but the Contra Costa Goldfields was never very common. And in fact, all of the populations in Contra Costa County were thought to be extinct until that one was rediscovered back in I think in the late 80s, early 90s. And it's this odd little place that kind of gets wet in the winter and then it kind of dries out in summer, and you get a mixture of the very common California goldfields and this rare species growing together. They can't interbreed, but they look quite a bit alike. And that really is a unique site, not just locally for the county, but globally, because about probably at most a quarter of the populations of that plant, and they're only ever known about 20, are extinct, have been extirpated by development. And so that really preserves one of the very few, maybe half a dozen, I don't know, something like that, sites for the whole world for that species of plant. So when the Muir Land Trust managed to get a hold of that little piece of property, what is it, Linus, about 8 acres or something?
It's about 15 acres, 35 total, but the Goldfields preserves about 15 acres. And yeah, with the cattle hooves providing this certain kind of habitat churn for the small pools of, sort of their own individual wetland kind of outcome. It's a fascinating process, but it's been a real success story. There were very few blooms when we took it over, and we've seen thousands and thousands over the years actually successfully come back. So we're pleased with that.
Yes, and I would mention that was that shows some of the really good work that the Muir Land Trust has done, because frankly, a lot of the government-oriented preservation groups, they would, like if the state or the state parks or someone got a hold of that land, nowadays they might be a little better, but at a certain time, the first thing they would do is take grazing off a site. And there's some cases where grazing is actually quite beneficial. Certainly, whether it was beneficial or not in the long run, if you take grazing off a site, if you acquire a site for preservation, you take grazing off it immediately, whatever you lost, you may have lost a long time ago to grazing, but whatever is still there because of the grazing, you're going to lose that now. So in other words, you're going to get degradation of habitat. It's a general rule that when you acquire a site for open space, and particularly for biodiversity conservation, you should be very careful and judicious about changing the management practices that have historically gone on there. Now, that may be something you want to do over time, but you do it very slowly and judiciously. In this case, the grazing has actually been beneficial to the population of the Contra Costa Goldfields.
That's great input. Thank you, Dee.
Great. Thank you, guys. I think we're going to wrap up after one more question, but before we do that, I just wanted to say if we didn't get to your question, we're sorry about that, and you can feel free to email us. I'm going to put the email addresses into our chat right now, and there it is. You should see it now. And our final question is from Nicole, and it's for Dean. How long did it take to learn the names and preferred locations of the local plants on your treks? Would you recommend a particular guide? Like she mentioned that hers does not have Trillium in it.
I did with my co-author Andy Muir write a Flora of the Carquinez Strait, which is an issue of Madronio, which is the Journal of Western Botany. It doesn't have any photos or illustrations in it. So combine, if you want a good list and has the keys, if you want to, if you're sophisticated using keys. Otherwise, for wildflower guides, I would think like some kind of local wildflower guide book would have to be a larger area, but to get it for like the San Francisco Bay wildflowers or trees, there's like the UC Press at one point, and they're still in press, put out a series of books about sort of Bay Area trees, Bay Area wildflowers, things like that. Those are like very good beginner's guides. And as far as learning it, it does take many years of just going out, and of course you can't just learn it in books. You have to get out and walk the land, and that's how you really start seeing these things. But if we start now, you'd be surprised at how much progress you can make in a short amount of time. Of course, my old professor, when we're teaching students the plant families, he used to say, he was from Texas, and he'd say, well, the first 50 families are the hardest, and I think he was right. At a certain point in time, it gets easier to add new ones, but it's there's no time like the present, and this is an okay spring, so I think it's a good time to get out and look at wildflowers.
Well, thank you guys all for your amazing responses on these questions that you did not see beforehand, and thank you very much from us behind the scenes. I will pass it over to Heidi really quick just to wrap it up.
Thank you guys so much. That was a great question and answer session. It's great to have you both here to answer questions about the same property in different ways. I think that's wonderful. And thank you all for joining us today. It was really wonderful. It's great to see this actually come to fruition and become this the beautiful views, the answers, people being able to participate. So I think going forward, although eventually we will be able to be out in the wild together again, we will probably continue to host these virtual hikes. and that opens it up for a lot more people that can't get to the top of that hill and that the hike is a little hard for. So stay tuned for more virtual hikes with John Muir Land Trust and Contra Costa Resource Conservation District. Check our website for events, and same with John Muir Land Trust. Our website is CCRCD.org, and there's an event section. So anything coming up will be on there. Also our Facebook page. Yeah, keep in touch with us. My email is hpetty@ccrcd.org if you're interested in the Carquinez Watershed Council. If you would like to ask any further questions, you can send them to me later on. This should be viewable for a while, so you can go back and view this again on your own time and maybe slow things down and listen a little more to each specific plant. But with that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Linus to kind of finish this up. And I appreciate you allowing us to use your wonderful property for this great hike.
Well, thanks, Heidi. And of course, that property really wouldn't be open and in such beautiful shape but for the RCD and all of your work and Dr. Kelch's work and so forth. So it's really a group effort. And of course, it's the land trust property, which means that it's everybody's property to really recreate and enjoy on. And just to reiterate, the properties are open. Be safe. Take those precautions. But it's so good for your physical and mental well-being right now, especially, but anytime, to get out and enjoy nature. It's really close by. Wherever you are, there's a land trust property that you can get to rather easily, and we really invite people to do so. And really, bring all of this information, and as somebody was saying, they want to learn more and memorize those plant names and so forth. There's so many different things to inquire about out there and just to enjoy. So please, come enjoy the properties.
And keep in mind that there are hikes available, guided hikes available on your phone with different apps. So check John Muir Land Trust site for those, and then you can also walk around and get a guided tour while you're doing the walk. So
right, jmlt.org, and it's all there for you. It's all available.
Do we have anything else? Anybody want to add anything at the end here? Any other questions? All right. Well, that being said, thank you so much for joining us for this wonderful hike. We will see you in the future virtually. Stay safe out there.